Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 14, Christ is going to deal with some questions about His activity on the Sabbath. Remember, Jesus lived under the Old Covenant law. He kept the Sabbath. He kept all of the requirements of the law. And when He died, He brought about His new covenant, which we are under today. It says in verse 1, Matthew chapter 12 and verse 1, at that time Jesus went through grain fields on the Sabbath, and His disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. Verse 2, but when the Pharisees saw this, they said to Him, look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath. So here you have Jesus and His disciples going through a grain field. It obviously wasn't their own grain field. But on the Sabbath day, as they were walking, evidently they were on their way to the synagogue. You'll find in verse 9, He was going to the synagogue, which was the Jewish custom to do on the Sabbath. And on the way, when they were hungry, they began to pick the grains of wheat, the head of the grain, and eat it. Now, let's look at the Sabbath right quick. Look at Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, you have the 10 Commandments given. It's not all the commandments that God gave through Moses, but the 10 are the heart of the law of Moses. Exodus 20 and verse 8. Exodus 20 and verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Verse 10. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, for you or your sons, your daughters, your male or female servants, or your cattle, your sojourners who stay with you. Verse 11. Here's the reason why. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So twice He refers to the Sabbath day under the new covenant, the old covenant, as holy. He says it in verse 8 of Exodus 20, and He says it again in verse 11. You are to work 6 days of the week. On the seventh day you are to cease your work. You, your family, your servants, your animals. It is holy unto the Lord. You're not to engage in any activity. Now, notice Deuteronomy chapter 23 concerning what Jesus and His disciples were doing. Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 25. Look at 24 and 25. God made provisions for the poor. And one way the poor could take care of themselves was by going through fields and picking some food for themselves, just enough to feed themselves, not going through and harvesting someone else's field. Look at Deuteronomy 23 and verse 24. When you enter your neighbor's vineyard, then you may eat grapes until you are fully satisfied, but you shall not put any in your basket. In other words, this was a way to help the traveler, help the poor feed themselves. They could go into a field, into a vineyard, and eat enough to satisfy their hunger, but they're not to go into their neighbor's vineyard and start harvesting their grapes and put them in the baskets. Look at verse 25, Deuteronomy 23 and 25. When you enter your neighbor's standing grain, then you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not wield a sickle in your neighbor's standing grain. So again, God is giving provision for the poor and for the weary traveler to go into a neighbor's field and with their hands pick some of the grain to satisfy their hunger. That was a provision in the law of Moses for them to do. But they could not go into their neighbor's field and start harvesting using the sickle just to start cutting down their crop. They were not allowed to do that. That would be stealing. That would constitute stealing. But you go in with just your hands and you can pick some to satisfy your hunger. That was a way God made provision for the poor and for those who were traveling. Now, let's put this into the context of Matthew chapter 12. Jesus, living under this law, was doing this very thing that God, through the law of Moses, made provisions for. In other words, Jesus was not doing anything wrong. He was doing what the law allowed. He could go through a field, chapter 12 and verse 1, a grain field on the Sabbath. He and his disciples were hungry. They began to pick the heads of grain and eat them. We've already seen from the law of Moses that was allowed. That was not a problem. And so Jesus was abiding within the law of Moses. And he was not doing any labor or any work, so to speak. He was not out harvesting that field, nor was his disciples. They became hungry. The law of Moses said when you are hungry and you're traveling, you can go to a neighbor's field, get just enough to satisfy you, and then go on. But don't pick a bunch of it, put it in a basket, or use a tool. Don't be harvesting your neighbor's grain fields or vineyards. But the Pharisees, verse 2, had a man-made law that said if you do any such activity like this, that you're working. They redefined working. And as a result, verse 2, the Pharisees, that religious group that oftentimes gave Jesus problems, said, look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. Well, they're thinking, they're believing that Christ and His disciples are breaking God's law. But they're not. We've already seen the passages concerning resting on the Sabbath, but also being able to feed yourself if you're traveling through a neighbor's grain field. So they were not breaking God's law. They were breaking their tradition. They were breaking the Pharisees' prohibition of doing stuff like this. In other words, the Pharisees came up with extra laws. They were very strict in obeying the law of God, and Christ never condemned them for doing that. He never condemned them for being very strict and meticulous in obeying the law of Moses. In fact, He even says in Matthew chapter 23, this you ought to have done. You're right in doing that. But they added a bunch of other laws. They're man-made traditions that came from Rabbi so-and-so and Rabbi this and scribe that. All these laws and these traditions that came from their ancestors, they added to the law of Moses, and they started prohibiting things that were not prohibited by God. And so they're accusing Jesus here of breaking the Sabbath. That was a serious crime. Because what happened if you broke the Sabbath under the law of Moses? You were put to death. You were stoned to death for breaking the Sabbath. So they watched Jesus and His disciples do this, which was right for them to do, which they had been given this right by the law of Moses to do, but according to their interpretation and their tradition, they were doing something that was not lawful to do on the Sabbath. Now notice Jesus' response, verse 3. He said to them, Matthew 12 and verse 3, have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions, verse 4, how he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated or the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priest alone? So here's argument number one he gives. Have you not read this in the Scriptures, talking about the Old Testament Scriptures, what King David did. He became hungry, and he and his companions' company needed some food. And you read about this in 1 Samuel chapter 21 and verse 6, how they went in on into the tabernacle area, and they ate the consecrated or the showbread. That bread was only to be eaten by the priest. David was not a priest. He was not even of the tribe of Levi. David was of the tribe of Judah. Only the priest, according to the law of Moses, were allowed to eat this consecrated or this showbread that was in the tabernacle. And he says, here's his argument. You believe that David was okay in doing this. You're condemning us for doing what we're doing, but you believe that David and his company were okay in eating this consecrated or showbread, which is not lawful for them to eat. You hold him up as a hero for doing something that was not lawful for them to do. Only the priests were allowed to eat that bread. And here's argument number 2, verse 5. Argument number 2. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? Now what's he talking about there? The priests on the Sabbath day are working in the temple. But they're not literally breaking the Sabbath because they are actually doing work, but it's prescribed work from God according to the law of Moses, and they're innocent in what they're doing. They're innocent in their activities because they're performing religious activities that God prescribed in the law of Moses. They're innocent in their activity. Here's the point that Jesus is making. We're doing some activity here in verse 1 that God allows. Yes, we're not to be working upon the Sabbath. We're not to be doing any work, not to be out harvesting grain or doing any labor like that. But God has made provision for us to do what we're doing. So number 1, the first argument is David did something wrong, but you thought he did something right. And number 2, you have the priest working on the Sabbath, doing their activity, but they're innocent. They're not doing anything wrong as they engage in their priestly activities. He says, verse 6, but I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. What's that talking about? Christ. Someone greater than the temple is here. In fact, Jesus said, if you destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll raise it up again. Talking about His body. Talking about them taking Him, crucifying Him, killing Him on the 3rd day, He would be resurrected. He is greater than the temple. And so He's saying in verse 6, here's someone that's greater than the temple, greater than the activities that are going on in the temple. And so what we're doing is not in any way a violation of God's law. He says in verse 7, but if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent or the guiltless, some translations might say. Notice what he says in verse 7. You would not have condemned the innocent. He's saying what we're doing is not wrong. You know, there are actual Bible scholars, they call themselves scholars, who say that Jesus actually broke the Sabbath here. He actually violated the Sabbath here and was trying to make the transition from the old way of the Old Testament into the New, trying to say that now you can work on the Sabbath day, that it's not a problem to work on the Sabbath day, and actually violated the Sabbath. That's not true. And there are some serious implications to that. If Jesus broke the Sabbath, what does that mean? He sinned. And if He sinned, what does that mean? He's not the sinless Son of God. And that means we don't have a Savior. That's how serious that implication is. I don't think people think about the implications of what they say. They're so concerned about what scholar so-and-so and doctor so-and-so said and professor so-and-so. They don't think about the implications of their statements. If Jesus actually broke the Sabbath, He sinned. And if He sinned, He's not sinless. And if He's not sinless, He can't be our Savior. That contradicts so many other passages. He did not break the Sabbath here. He was doing what was lawful. He was doing what was provided, as we've already seen. He said, if you would have known what this says in verse 7, if you would have known what this says, and he's quoting from Hosea 6:6 from the prophets. I desire, talking about God, says, I desire compassion and not sacrifice. You would have not condemned the innocent. I desire compassion and not sacrifice. In other words, God, throughout the prophets, oftentimes would say, you're sacrificing to me, you're going through these ceremonies, you're going through your Sabbath, you're going through your festivals, but your heart is not compassionate. You're not doing my will. And in fact, in Isaiah chapter 1, He tells them, stop it. Stop sacrificing to me. Stop celebrating these festival days. Stop doing these things. Stop worshiping me because it's noise to me, because your heart is not right. You don't have compassion. You don't care about the poor. You're stepping upon the weak. You're showing inhumanity to your fellow man. You get yourself right, then you come worship me. That's exactly what it's saying here in Hosea 6 and verse 6. If you would have known this, if you Pharisees would have known what this means, I desire compassion and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. In other words, God in His mercy and compassion made it possible for the weary traveler to eat some grain or to eat some grapes in a field of the neighbor. That's God's mercy and compassion. And so God desires us to have mercy and compassion, not just to go through the sacrificial motions. Remember what we talked about in our sermon this morning. It's not enough just to take the Lord's Supper. You've got to take it correctly. You've got to take it in the right manner. It's not enough just to give. You've got to give in a cheerful way. Not out of necessity, but because you want to, you desire to. It's not enough just to go through the motions. The heart must be there in what we do. We must be passionate about what we do, and we must do it in a way that is pleasing to God. We must worship in spirit and in truth. And so Jesus here is basically saying, we're innocent. You're condemning us, and we're innocent. Now, they did violate the Pharisees' concept of the Sabbath, but not God's. And after all, look at verse 8. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. The Son of Man there is referring to Jesus. He is Lord. That word means master, ruler of the Sabbath. Jesus ought to know what the Sabbath is all about. He gave it. As Almighty God, before He took on human flesh, in the burning bush, as He called Moses to deliver the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage, took them to Mount Sinai, and as God gave these laws. Now here, the one who gave the law at Mount Sinai is in human flesh. He ought to know how it's supposed to be kept. He gave it. And so He is fulfilling perfectly what the law requires. So they have made laws where there are no laws, and that is dangerous. And sometimes we can be guilty of that if we're not careful. You ever heard someone say, and I was taught this when I was younger, that you shouldn't do any type of work at all on Sunday. That you shouldn't mow your lawn. That you shouldn't do any work at all on Sunday because you're violating Sunday. and that it would be sinful to do that. Well, where's that in the Scripture? I was taught that I shouldn't mow the lawn on Sunday. Now, I'm not talking about mowing the lawn to miss worship service. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, like on Sunday afternoon after worship service, get out there and mow my lawn. Some brethren think that's a sin. That's a violation of something. We're supposed to rest on Sunday. The Bible doesn't talk about Sunday as being a day of rest. Nowhere says that. We assume, I don't know why, that the Sabbath requirements of rest and no work have been passed on to Sunday. Well, where did we get that? And even some have called Sunday the Christian Sabbath. The Bible doesn't call it that. The Bible doesn't call it the Christian Sabbath. It's called the first day of the week, upon which we do what we talked about in our sermon this morning. And so we need to be careful that if you have some concepts about working on Sunday or whatever, that realize that they might be personal opinions, and don't try to impose those things on everyone else. Please understand that I'm not talking about missing worship service for work. That shouldn't be done by any Christian. Right, then women don't have to cook on Sundays because that would be work. So, there you go. That would be, I guess some that believe that way wouldn't. I guess they would go out to eat or something like that. But that would be a logical conclusion. But see, we need to be careful that we don't come up with rules that aren't there. We need to abide by the law of Christ, Galatians 6 and verse 2. Do what it says, but don't add to. And we'll talk about that more in our Sunday night sermon when we talk about whether we should be using one cup in our Lord's Supper, as some brethren say. Yes? Mm-hmm.
And under the law, you were to rest your animals too.
Mm-hmm.
So they will not work on something that.
I think that's a good practice and a good policy, as Ned said back in the early days of in the early 1900s and such. Christians would not work on Sunday, and they would rest their animals on Sunday. Their farm animals that they would use in plowing and pulling wagons and things of that nature, and they would use it as a day of rest, and there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, there's good reason to do that. And so, as far as a practical practice of saying Sunday is going to be a day of rest, that's devotion to God, that's not a problem. It's a problem when we start making that a requirement, that if you are found out in your yard doing any yard work on Sunday between services, which I don't know why anyone would want to do in this hot weather, but if you're found doing that, you would be sinning. Well, that's just not the case, scripturally speaking. But as far as a rule, when I was working in the secular world, I made it very clear to my employer, I'm not working on Sunday. That was a non-negotiable. I will not work on Sunday. Now, if you need me to come in between services for whatever reason, I can do that, but I'm not going to miss worship service. So it's not the concept of working that becomes the problem on the first day of the week. It's the concept of missing worship. So, verse 8, Matthew chapter 12 and verse 8, the Son of Man, of course that emphasizes His humanity, and also is a messianic description. You find that description found in the book of Daniel. The Son of Man is presented before the Ancient of Days. And so that's a title of the Messiah. He is the Lord or the ruler of the Sabbath. He knows what the Sabbath is all about. He gave it as God, and He will take it away as man on the cross. He's going to die, take the law, fulfill it completely, and then by His shed blood instigate a new covenant. in which we meet upon the first day of the week. So they make an accusation in verse 2, you and your disciples are doing what's not lawful, and he talks to them about the situation. He said, yes, what we're doing is lawful. We are innocent. There's nothing that we're doing that's wrong. Verse 9, departing from there, he went into the synagogue. So evidently he was on his way to the synagogue. Verse 10, and a man was there whose hand was withered. So here's a person who had a withered hand, probably by some sort of a severe arthritis. A severe arthritis that would cause the hand to just draw up and be withered. It would become withered due to lack of use. And a man was there who had this visible ailment. Keep that in mind. It was a visible ailment everyone knew and could see. The man was there whose hand was withered, verse 10, and they questioned Jesus, asking, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So that they might accuse him. Now notice their wickedness here. They're not even questioning the fact that Jesus can heal. They know He can. They've seen Him do it. They're going to see if He's going to heal on the Sabbath so they can accuse Him of breaking the Sabbath. I mean, talk about twisted thinking. And so they're watching Him, just waiting for Him to mess up, just hoping they would so they could accuse Him. And so they wanted to know, is it lawful or right to heal on the Sabbath that they might accuse Him? Verse 11. He said to them, what man is there among you who has a sheep, and if it fall into the pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Do some translations might say ox or something of that nature, a sheep or an ox. Either way, any animal. He's saying here, if you have an animal and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, which of you will not take hold of it and lift it out? In other words, there are certain situations that happen on the Sabbath day that don't fall under the category of labor in the sense of your normal work, that require activity. And you can lift your animal out of the pit and not be violating the Sabbath. Verse 12. How much more valuable then is a man than a sheep? So then, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. To do good is lawful. No, you're not supposed to labor or work. That's a day that has been set aside by God for you to rest and to worship. But if some emergency situation comes up, like your animal, your ox, or your sheep falling into a pit on the Sabbath, you rescuing that animal is not violating the Sabbath. You're not doing anything wrong. And animals are not as important as men. Man is more important than a sheep. So it is lawful to do what is good on the Sabbath. Verse 13. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and it was restored to normal like the other. So here you have a visible healing of a person that had an obvious problem. This was a miracle. The person's hand was restored to normal like the other. As I said before, what people think are miracles today are not miracles when you compare it to what the Bible actually says about miracles. This was an actual miracle. And so it was visible, it could be seen, the ailment was obvious, and so he stretched it out and it became normal like the other. You don't see that on TV. You don't see that at the tent meetings of these so-called faith healers. It don't happen. It just don't happen. Notice the reaction. The Pharisees aren't going to rejoice over this. The Pharisees went out and conspired against him as to how they might destroy him. He performs a miracle in the midst of them all in the synagogue there, and the reaction of the Pharisees is, we've got to destroy him. We've got to kill him. It shows how hard their heart is. And it's going to come to a high point later on in the chapter when they contribute his power to Beelzebub or Beelzebul, the prince of the demons. And also verse 38. Now I want you to keep this in mind. We're going to look at verse 38 right quick. Verse 38 and 39. Some of the scribes and Pharisees said to him, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign, and yet no sign will be given to it but the sign of Jonah the prophet. Keep that in mind with everything that we're seeing in chapter 12. They're wanting a sign, but what's he giving them? Miracle after miracle after miracle. And see, the reason I bring that up is when you go up to these people who claim to perform miracles and you ask them to do what they claim, they'll quote Matthew 12 and verse 39, An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. But he's already shown them miracle after miracle after miracle. And they're rejecting every one of them. They don't say the miracle didn't happen. They just reject it and say, oh, he does that by the power of Satan. So in the context here, he's already been showing them miracles. You know, when I go up and ask someone who claims to perform a miracle, I'm looking for the very first one. And they get mad for you asking them. Strange. Look at verse 15, Matthew 12 and verse 15. But Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there. Many followed him, and he healed some of them. He healed all of them. He didn't heal 50% of them. He didn't just heal the ones that had internal ailments and the rest that had obvious ailments. He kind of pushed them to the side. Every person he attempted to heal, he healed. It was a 100% success rate in him healing. He healed all of them. Verse 16, and he warned them not to tell who he was. We talked about that earlier, how that he wanted to have the mobility to go around to these different communities. Verse 17, this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He's going to be quoting from Isaiah chapter 42, verses 1 through 3. This is a prophecy in Isaiah about the work of the Messiah, the suffering servant. Behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, talking about the Holy Spirit. And he shall proclaim justice to all the Gentiles. He will not quarrel, nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A battered reed he will not break off, a smoking wick or flax he will not put out, until he leads justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles or the nations will hope. So here you have the reason why Jesus said in verse 16, warned them not to tell who he was. Jesus did not want fanfare just for the sake of his miracles. He wanted people to follow him because of his teaching. Because of who he was and because of his teaching. Not just to follow him because of his miracles. So this prophecy in Isaiah is talking about Christ being the chosen one. The Spirit of God is upon him. That happened at his baptism. The Spirit of God came upon him. He's going to proclaim justice to the Gentiles or the nations. In other words, this gospel is for everyone, not just the Jews. He's not going to quarrel or fight or cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. That doesn't mean he's not preaching. That simply means he's not calling attention to himself just for the sake of attention. He wants people to genuinely follow him. Verse 20, a battered reed he will not break off, and a smoking wick or flux he will not put out. In other words, he's not there to cause harm. He's there to help. Those who are broken reeds, those who are smoldering wicks, he's not going to put them out. He's there to help, not to hurt. So his work is there to help the Jewish people and all people. He's going to lead justice to victory, And in His name, the nations or the Gentiles will have hope. That's good news for everyone because the gospel is for the Jew first and also to the Gentile or the Greek. Romans chapter 1 and verse 16 is the power of God unto salvation. We'll continue to looking at Matthew chapter 12 next week, Lord willing.